How's it going, my friends? Welcome to Carpo's video. I guess most likely, well, I'm going to start off by saying that this video is totally off the cusp and not intended to really push any viewpoints one way or another. And as well, I'll probably be partaking in vaping and drinking coffee and whatnot because I'm fulfilling my human addictions. And I just got finished with dinner. Had some delicious salmon. My wife made salmon and some corn on the cob and some pineapple, and it was delicious. So after I have my dinner, I always have this thing about an after dinner cup of coffee. Anyway, enough about my habits. I just wanted to say that, I didn't want to jump right in on a subject and make this one of those videos where it appears that I'm trying to make some sort of a point. I become very animated and very intense when I make videos. Sometimes I sit down and I've got my vape pen. I like to vape while I'm thinking, but I don't even want to stop to vape or to take a drink of coffee because I'm so into what I'm saying when I'm making a video. But that's something that I do to learn. It helps me when I keep going. Don't break my stride. On the other hand, taking a break for a moment allows me to kind of gather my thoughts. I've always seen these, a lot of folks, they cut their videos up a lot, and they'll make a video and then they'll cut out all the blank parts, so it's like boom, 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 and they're just intense the whole time. It seems like they're just boom. But in reality, they're maybe they didn't say something they wanted to say, or maybe they're just cutting out dead space. But I feel like if I cut up my videos, I feel like I talk too much already, as is, I wanted to talk about evolution and creationism. And this topic, it's not something that I really just jumped into. I mean, this is actually I have a few videos that I've made. In fact, I think I made one last year called Evolution versus Creationism. And I'm sure I've made several. But it's a subject I haven't tackled a lot because I don't want to hear all the, let's just say, opinions and theories and regurgitated information that people have, whether they be on the creationist or the evolution side. But I did spend a couple hours looking through information today, just to kind of give myself another, what do you call it, refresher, I guess, in the ideas, and to see if any new information come forward since the last time I looked into this. And what I mean when I'm talking about looking into it is genetics, how genetics affect us as humans, which evolutionary traits are genetic and which ones could be caused by our own behaviors passed on to our children. Let me give you an example. If 20 years ago a biologist said, did you know that the actions that you take now and the diet that you have right now, these things will affect your offspring and perhaps their offspring? People would laugh in their face. In fact, many people were laughed out of the room for, postulating such nonsense, No, of course not. Your genetics remain the same, and that only the evolution, rather the mating, sharing those chromosomes, creating a new life is what supposedly changes. In other words, the behaviors that the things that we do, we didn't believe that changed our actual genes. But it does. And there was a European, a study they did in a particular region in Europe a while back, and found out that in areas where there wasn't a lot of food to eat, where there was a lot of hunger going on, during years where they had the people who really gorged, the people who ate really well seemed, for a short period of time during that famine, I can't remember the details, but it turned out that their grandchildren on average lived like 30 years less, which is a huge significant number. Not just 3 or 5 years, but like 30 years less. And they were kind of shocked. And whenever science comes up with something that, a study or information that can't be assimilated into the current paradigm, It's either cast out, ridiculed, or ignored. Now, this is something I've observed so many times with religion. I grew up not religious, but I've known and met and discussed enough with enough religious people, namely Christians, of course, that I always get the same answers. Whenever they seem to not be able to explain something, it just becomes, it's God's word, or because it says so in the Bible. Well, how do you know the Bible's true? And they'll say, the circular argument. The Bible says it's true, therefore it's true. It's an interesting argument, but the same thing happens with science, genetics. You tell somebody something that may be true and they laugh at you and they're like, no, this is what it says because this is what happened. A perfect example is evolution. Beyond genetics, now we know that we can change our genes by how we act. Rather, the foods that we eat, the choices that we make, probably mental patterns and behaviors. There have been animal studies where they've shown that chickens who were put into a very let's just say they screw up their schedule. They turn the lights on and off at weird times and have strange feeding schedules. Well, it turns out that they become poorer at running these particular mazes, and they pass that on to their offspring. The chicks that are born have this same problem. So it appears that natural selection isn't necessarily nature choosing. Okay, well this bear was white and the background snow, therefore the polar bear survives and the brown bear doesn't. This is what natural selection has posted as an actual theory, and it totally makes sense. If you look at the way that the genetic trees are traced, when we say, okay, if you go back in time, you can look at genetics and say that we branched off from these creatures here and these creatures here. And they do that by finding protein chains, I believe is what they are. Areas or particular chains within the DNA strand that are the same as another animal, whatever it may be. This, by their standards, puts us closer to mice on this chart than to elephants. But if you look at what they call like microgenetics or microDNA, something like that, it's a different type of testing. It puts us closer to elephants. These same studies say that, I believe that that a mammal left land to go and become a whale. Now, all of this just gets crazy really fast. The point being that none of us as individuals can grasp the entirety of history, how far back it really goes. You talk about 4.5 billion years, sure, you can say, okay, well, maybe things could have evolved in that time. My thing that has always been that I believe that evolution occurs, but that natural selection itself is just one of the traits of the universe, one of the evolutionary traits. It's not just natural selection. There seems to be a blueprint for life that existed before life existed. So, I know I had so many things that I wanted to cover, but it's like I'm just jumping from idea to idea because it's impossible to cover this in the time I've got here. Guess I got all the time in the world if I really want to, but I don't want people to be bored as hell. So, evolution is something that we can see happening. Certain animals, whether they adapt to the environment or whether it just happens that natural selection says that, if a bird's born with a longer beak and that helps them to get more food, then those animals are more likely to survive in the group and that, they will dominate over time. And that makes sense. The problem with that theory is that that's assuming that that particular genetic mutation actually survives, that it doesn't break a leg or have damaged offspring or other genetic defects. There's so many things that have to play into it. But when you get into the debate about whether animals evolved or not, you're pretty much just ridiculed and laughed at by evolutionary biologists, because if you have any question about how things really came to be, then you're looked at as the fool. And that's changing, because they're starting to look like fools when they try to defend a point that they haven't even considered yet. And I'm talking about the ones who take biology and their science as almost a cult practice like religion. to where they believe what they've been told, because you realize each scientist has his own little area of expertise. Some of them have wide fields, but the point is that when you specialize in one subject, you have to trust that other people in other subjects are putting forth the same effort as you. And I am not dissing on science at all, because actually I'm always defending science when I'm in arguments. You know, people say, well, scientists are trying to disprove this and say this isn't true, and I say, thank God they are, because now we no longer think that people who are having seizures are possessed by the devil, you know, or mental issues mean you're a witch, you know. Things have changed for the better, but at the same time, science has become almost like a life raft to grab onto whenever we don't understand something. And lo and behold, if science can't explain it, then we feel kind of lost. And some people go from that, use that as a catalyst or an excuse to say, well, science doesn't have the answers, therefore religion must be true. And others say, well, religion doesn't have the answers, so science must be true. And I say they're both wrong, in the sense that they both have wrong pieces. There are many great things about religion that help people, and it's never been about religion as a problem. It's about dogma and pushing it on others and how it affects the world because of our fears. If you feel like humans are tainted and that humans are born sinners, and that if you don't follow certain instructions then you're going to burn eternally in hell, then it's very difficult to have a conversation with the person who believes that and have them not blow you off or think you're lesser because you don't believe what they do. And it's hard. In the same regard, I'd like to say there are a lot of people who are religious who feel like scientists just put them down and ridicule them. And if you look on the forums and YouTube videos and elsewhere, I mean, everybody knows how bad people who are intellectuals or very intelligent academics will tear into people who don't. People who just say, you know, well, I love God and that's the way it is. And somebody will tear into them and say, yes, you're just basing this on your feelings, using your subjective experience, yada yada. And then the person feels even worse. And my point there is that if you really want people to listen or even have a discussion, you have to talk to them on the same level. I learned long ago that people who are religious aren't dumb. But when I was younger, I just thought that they were fooled, you know. And I also now realize that scientists aren't all intelligent, nor do they all follow the proper procedures and rules. But beyond that, even the ones that do are limited in the scope of their understanding. One person can't look back and say, okay, well, it should have taken this long for an animal to evolve into this, and then perhaps they branched off here. To try to assimilate all that information and then to confirm it and to check it and recheck it, it's near impossible at this point. And so it takes several people in several fields to put that all together. And it's fascinating the things that we've discovered. First off, you know, things like some of the evolutionary traits that we've used, things like, oh, well, we have a lot of crap in our body that we don't need. I can't remember what they call it, but they're like, you know, things like that they used to think had no purpose, such as the tonsils and the appendix, which they found completely do have uses. The appendix, you know, has its little bacterial colonies. It helps with the stomach. But since we didn't understand certain... Oh, and even the tailbone. People say that the tailbone is left over from, you know, our evolution. And I always believed that was true, but it also has... But it may not be. It just may be an what they call a horizontal... Or there's a name for it, where two creatures evolve the same components separately in separate areas, not because they were evolved from each other. So I'm not here disputing evolution at all. I want to make that clear. I believe that evolution is one of the tools that creation makes itself out of. So let's go back to the root of this. At one point, there had to be a cell, okay? And this cell, you know, breaking down further, you have the DNA, which has the programming for these cells, right? When you're born, all of that programming is put within that, just like in a seed. It has the genetic blueprint for the plant. Your egg has the genetic blueprint for the embryo that will form. It's very difficult to get into the discussion about where did this initial egg come from. And people will say, well, proteins assembled. You know, you can go back to what they call the primordial soup. And then this is the theory of evolution, you know, that there was a primordial soup on Earth and that matter, you know, somehow proteins and amino acids created, and then proteins, and then they all formed into these crazy chains, which some of them are just irreducible. So, I mean, it doesn't make sense. But to set all that aside for a minute and just look at the basic first cell or first DNA, where did that programming come from? And you can't just say that something randomly assembled and happened to replicate. It doesn't work that way. That's leaving out very important components of this thing. And it's hard for me to try to explain it because I'm trying to keep it in layman terms, because I'm a layman on this too. But I'm not going to read a bunch of, facts and figures, because what's the point? People who believe one way or another believe one way or another. But it goes back to the old, what came first, the chicken or the egg? And it has nothing to do with chickens or eggs. It's really just, the egg of, life, the creation of an actual organism. There's bacteria which have what they call flagella, and they're like little propellers. Now these little these little bacteria flagella, they're basically just like the propeller on a boat, okay? And they're perfectly designed, or I should say they perfectly work. I can't say they're designed, and it takes, I believe, like 3 proteins to make this work. If you remove any one of those proteins, it doesn't work. Trying to grasp and get to the point where, okay, something happened to randomly mutate or form, and then taking that a step further to say, well, it just replicated, and then it continued to survive and get more and more complex. That's when a lot of evolutionary biologists say, well, it takes time, and we're talking about billions of years. But if you look at the actual statistics on how long it would take for something like that to form, they say the chances are so astronomical. I mean, beyond astronomical, like, 10 to the 500th power impossible, just ludicrous numbers. But it's still easy for somebody to say, well, it could have happened. But that's really taking a leap. If you're a scientist and you're saying, well, that chance must have happened, that's really faith in that, that belief without evidence. Because from what I've seen, there's really no understanding of many of these chains, between what they call the missing links. What creationists will seize on this and use it to say, well, then the Bible's true. But it's not fair to just jump to that conclusion, because that's what makes people afraid to even have an opinion on it, because they're afraid they'll be considered creationists. Me, from my standpoint, I don't really care anymore. I'm not trying. I've decided, a lot of folks are trying to find God or whatnot, or to try to convince themselves that they're going to be okay after they die. I don't have any illusions, We very well may just die and die. But we very well may also have a much deeper place in the universe. It really doesn't matter, because the whole point is that we live this life right now, and we want to learn as much as we can about ourselves and our world. Some of us do. And it seems to me, and I may be just completely off base in thinking this, but when I look around at the world, I say, fuck, it's just amazing. The symbiosis between animals and plants, the relationships between certain parasites and their hosts, or the symbiosis between, let's say, algae and fungus, which have created lichen, which allows lichen to be basically like algae that can grow out of water. And these plants and animals which have worked together for so long, butterflies that look like owls, and animals that have certain features that you just can't understand how they could get. Like one guy proposed that giraffes' necks got long because over time they needed to reach up to get leaves, so their necks got longer. And he was laughed out. I mean, to this day, that whole idea is laughed at. They're like, that's ludicrous. It was a random mutation. But is it really that ludicrous? Because now, in the last decade or two, they've found that the behaviors we have in this life really do affect our grandchildren. So is it possible that giraffes are growing longer necks merely because to a person who has never studied these things, it may seem obvious. Like, well, of course the environment affects the animal. But according to evolutionary biology, the environment does not affect the animal as far as evolutionary traits. In other words, if an animal moves to a colder climate, they will not develop a thicker coat to deal with that climate, according to the theory. they will just, maybe one will happen to have a thicker coat and that one will survive. And that's random mutation, okay? Natural selection is kind of a joke word, if you don't know. It's natural selection basically just says whoever has the most kids wins. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're naturally selected because you're white or black or have paws or spikes or whatever. And many people are afraid to tackle this subject because when you get into it like this, you know, it's easy for a person to just say you don't know the science. You just don't understand the science. And that's why I spent about 2 hours today looking over not just the science, but both sides of it. I looked at it from the creationist standpoint, arguing their point, and I looked at it from the evolutionary biologist standpoint. And then I looked at it from the neutral ground of, and I actually looked up to see what people said about them both being wrong. And that's the one I most agree with. Because confirmation bias is what gets us into trouble. This is what makes people skeptical of science. It's also what makes people skeptical of religion. I'm skeptical of both. But to me, science isn't an organization or a they or a group. It's merely a method. But scientists stick together. It's just like saying, well, all religions aren't, there's no such thing as a religion. There's just religious people and their religious method. But they all do tend to congregate. They may have their own ways of doing things as individuals, but there's something they all share and a certain agreement. You don't stand up in church and say, well, I don't agree with your assessment of when Jesus lived, even if you may. And that's the same way in science. You can't stand up and say, hey, maybe perhaps there's more to this tree than we thought. They talk about junk DNA, and for those who don't know, there is no junk DNA. 20 years ago, we were told, that 98% of DNA in our body was garbage, and that only 2% were used to encode proteins. Now we find out that between 20 and 80% are used for proteins. It might even be more. I mean, I don't know how many. At this point, there basically a lot of people believe that 100% of our DNA is necessary. That we use, 100% of our genetic code is necessary. There may be a few, flukes here and there, but for the most part, you can't assume that 98% of our genetics is garbage. I mean, that's what people say when they don't get something. I can compare this to the dark matter, Astronomers just don't understand what the hell's going on in space, so they ascribe dark matter to be a majority of the universe. The reason why they think dark matter exists is only because galaxies are pushing apart from one another when they believe they should be pulling back together, and dark matter is used to explain that. I can't say whether it's right or wrong, neither can anybody. It's hard. You can't look at galaxies and say, oh, it's redshift because they're moving away. Maybe color changes over that distance. Maybe there's something we don't understand, or somewhere in space a blanket that makes it appear red. Not a blanket, but gases. There are a million answers that could be, but we usually dig for the one that helps us the most. And with evolution, it's the exact same way. We fill in the gaps with our creation and our ideas and our delusions in both religion and science. And I think that it's important to look at both sides, because it appears to me that there's something deeper going on.